Hello, friends. Welcome to episode 8 of Ents and Sensibility, the podcast for everyone who loves bold, witty women, awkward, handsome men, and dragons. Today, we're going to do something a little different, but I hope you enjoy it. Today, I have a special guest. I am talking with Amanda-Rae Prescott, a cosplayer, fellow nerd, and a contributor for Den of Geeks, where she covers period dramas like Sanditon and Bridgerton, sci-fi and fantasy, such as Doctor Who, and so much more. A few weeks ago, I put a call out on Twitter to discuss racism within the Jane Austen community, and Amanda-Rae was kind enough to reach out, and we had a long conversation that went on far longer than either of us expected our Zoom call to last. So today's episode does have a discussion of Chapter 8 of Sense and Sensibility, but before that, you'll hear my conversation with Amanda-Rae. Now, I've edited this conversation down for the podcast, but you'll be able to listen to the entire thing on entsandsensibility.com. So here is my conversation with Amanda-Rae Prescott, and I'll be back to begin our discussion on Chapter 8 afterwards. For the first time on Ents and Sensibility, we actually have a guest today. This is Amanda-Rae Prescott, and I will let you introduce yourself, Amanda. Tell the listeners a little bit about yourself, what you do, and your interest in Jane Austen.
Cool. My name is Amanda-Rae Prescott. I am a freelance journalist for Den of Geek, Doctor Who magazine. I also recently started working with GBH in Boston. That's their PBS affiliate for news, reviews, and things as a freelancer. So my interests are all over the place in terms of television. Like, I like not just Austen-based media. I also like all period dramas. I love watching even the mysteries and contemporary shows out of the UK. So it's a lot of I have a little bit of a grab bag. But in terms of Austen, my role in was the TV and movie adaptations, and then I'm starting to read the novels or reread them, depending which one we're talking about here. I actually finished Persuasion a couple days ago for the first time, which is kind of cool because I remember watching the adaptations, years ago, back when they were released, and then now. Yes, so slowly but surely, my main interest in Austen is sort of through the various adaptations over the years, and then also I like historical costuming and cosplay, so that's also another way in for me. Like, I am very visual in that sense. I love figuring out, hey, I can see that thing on the screen. I also have a huge interest in the community in terms of social media and diversity issues, because as a woman of color, I'm noticing there's so much stuff that needs to be worked on, and as somebody who's tried to run their own spaces in the fandom and constantly seeing a lot of gatekeeping, a lot of undercover racism, if not like overt racism in the community, and I've gone through quite a couple negative experiences in the Austen world space. So a lot of my work online, especially on my Twitter account, is basically exposing people who are not just talking about stuff I like, but a lot of times I'm talking about the stuff I don't like in fandom, and a lot of it is white people trying to use their privilege to shout down people of color, to shout down LGBTQ folks, all that stuff. That's sort of I think a lot, when people first hear my name in fandom, it's probably what they're like, yeah, that girl who's always talking about how terrible people are in fandom. Like, yeah, I have to, because there are other people talking about it, but I feel like some people are affiliated with Jasna or other official organizations, there's not as much they can say online. I'm not a member of Jasna or anything, so I'm not beholden to them. I'm also not beholden to studios and networks and stuff like that too. So I'm like, if I see, stuff that's going on elsewhere, I can totally comment on it because they're not really paying me. So I don't belong to an organization. So like, I won't get censured for calling anybody out.
I unpacked a lot there.
Sorry, that was a
no,
lot.
that's awesome. This is exactly why I was so excited when I just put that out on Twitter. Hey, does anyone want to talk about this topic with me? And you said absolutely. And I went through your Twitter. I'm like, oh yes, this is perfect. She is perfect for this. So we have a lot to unpack.
Okay.
I live in Rhode Island. I used to live in Mass. I know what GBH is. Not everyone does, but that's the local PBS station in Boston. I am insanely jealous because that is an awesome job.
Ironic, and mind you, I'm just a freelancer, so I'm not like in their offices and stuff. Like I just, they send me, they're like, hey, you want to write about this stuff? And then I'm like, sure. So, ironically, I'm from Brooklyn, so I'm not sure how that happened in life. I'm from Brooklyn, writing for our theoretical enemies in sports, at least, Boston. No, I know the folks who work at 13 here, and it's just that, those positions are probably already filled. So, they have their, mostly write on their blog, because if you look up anything related to the Long Song in particular, I wrote one article on all creatures great and small and race as well. So that's I'm kind of their go-to person on those topics, because I do a lot of dives on my Twitter account and in my writing on how these fandoms are seen, and especially the race angle, because a lot of times when people are reviewing these British TV shows, they're not going to think about that because they're white. It's like, I'm Caribbean American, so I can, and I know the black history behind a lot of the UK stuff. I mean, there's some shows will stump me on terms of history, but in most of the stuff that's coming out recently, I am familiar with, like, the background information that people probably miss. So that's kind of what I do as well. That's another sideline of mine.
So you talked about calling out white people who are talking trash about people of color portraying characters in on TV, or even fans who are people of color. What are some of the things that you see? Some of these things that aren't so
a great example, and unfortunately, I hate to use these things as examples, but I'm going to start with a not so Austen related example of Bridgerton that just passed on Netflix. My background in Bridgerton is that I received the Netflix screeners because I work with Dana Geek as a freelancer. I received them an entire month and change before everybody else. So pretty much when I watched Bridgerton, it was pretty much only the people in the industry at that point have seen it. And I already knew going in it was going to be controversial in Austen's faces, because the show was not attempting to portray the Regency the way Austen would. The show is based on a contemporary historical romance series. They did inclusively cast, but they did not always. Some of the characters of color, unfortunately, they're portraying things that can be interpreted as stereotypes because of the fact that these plots originally have no white characters in the books. So I know I'm well aware of a lot of the Bridgerton related critiques, because I've written some of them for Dana Geek. But in terms of fandom, what annoyed the heck out of me in these Austen groups is that the first thing people were saying were, oh, the costumes are inaccurate. They were not supposed to be Austen-inspired costumes. Oh, why is
that's
the queen black or biracial? This is a problem. The fact that is what people are, or even worse, they're saying Bridgerton is too woke. Woke is a term that was originally used by African Americans to describe people who fought for, racial equality and things, and now it's an insult word, or calling things politically correct. There is a lot of people who always look for slurs in fandom, but a lot of times they're not going to use slurs. They're going to use things such as historical accuracy, which is a very broad term, but at the same time, it's often applied to efforts to increase racial diversity a lot of times in fandom, and even in adaptations or on, in especially or authors who are writing Austen inspired things, that term, it's never used, it is used to talk about, people not getting dates and figures right in other adaptations, but those same people are silent when there's historical errors about white characters, about white biographical characters, or even white fictional characters. They're more upset by somebody playing Asian, who was an Asian actor in the Regency than, for example, then something like that's completely has nothing to do with race. But all of a sudden are like, those same people who are like low-key racist are like, oh no, historical accuracy. But here's the thing, like, many historians of this era have figured out that black people existed. Other groups, Indian people exist in this era. All the folks in South Asia exist in this era in England, and so it's like in other, and even East Asia, it's like, this is ridiculous. Why are you guys talking about this? Because also too, like, this is history where England was a colonial power. So these people from their colonies are coming back and forth. It wasn't necessarily they were coming as slaves. Some were coming as servants, domestic servants otherwise, but then you have a lot of people who are just working there, trading, even their political leaders. It's kind of a ridiculous notion. And the reason why people think this way is because they were taught inaccurate history. And this is why this comes up time and time again in these fandoms, because for every person who was read, for example, many of the folks who are working on this, on these, on documenting the actual what happened in the era, you have these people who've been reading inaccurate history for 20, 30 plus years. They've even gone to school and learned inaccurate history, and that, so all of a sudden you give them an article written by, say, David Olusoga or some other professors, they're just like, what the heck is this? That's not what I learned. That has to be wrong. And I'm like, wait, no, they're using the same primary sources or even new ones that were found, but all of a sudden it's a problem. So yeah, Bridgerton was one of, and that a lot of that Bridgerton debate happened inside Austen groups because, of course, it was advertised as Regency romance, but of course people are not realizing there's a difference between Regency romance and Austen-inspired works. That's two different things. One is Regency according to modern romance writers, and the other is attempting to recreate elements of Austen's world, even if they're going to have their own original ideas on plots. The other problem, I think the bigger one, honestly, in terms of specifically Austen's cases, is second issue. You have what happens when there's a new adaptation and you see the casting go out. You see the generic PR photo and the generic, the photo they grab from, like, Getty Images of the actor. It's not even what they would look like in costume because the thing's not going to be filmed for 6 months. And then reacting negatively because there's, people being cast in white roles. Like, for example, the new Persuasion adaptation, there was a lot of nasty comments about Joel Fry. Not just that he's wrong for the role, but a lot of things was like, he's too young. He's 31 years old. You're only saying he's too young because he clearly has some African ancestry in him, and he's not going to look like a white person in his 30s. So when they say he's too young, that's code for I don't recognize what he looks like according to white beauty standards. So things like that, there's another example. It's like they say something, but what they're really saying is this person does not, or this fact, or this does not fit what I've been taught as somebody who's white. That's what it is. It's a lot of coded language a lot of times. But the worst incident of all for this has to be the Sanditon Pineapple Saga, or Pineapple Gate, as I called it.
I was going to ask you about that because I thought the metaphor within the scene was really interesting. You have this beautiful pineapple that everyone's showing up, and inside it's rotten and, full of worms and stuff. So, but tell me a little bit about the fallout from that.
So to rewind people back, because now we're going a bit back in time to the middle of 20.
That was late last year?
No, this actually started 2019. We're talking about the fall of 2019. Summer to fall, because what happens a lot of times at Jane Austen fandom is that the UK airing or premiere something, there's a whole conversation going on, and then when it comes to America, there's essentially a completely different conversation, but because of copyright law and because of social media has kind of broken down copyright law to a lot of extent. A lot of people I'm actually one of these people, I like to watch stuff online from the UK before it comes to America, because a lot of times I can get context that people are missing. I read interviews. I'm not afraid of spoilers, even though, you know, some of the U.S. networks may frown on that practice. But in terms of, for Sanditon, I wanted to see what was going on in the UK because of Georgiana Lamb. And I wanted to see what they did with her character, because in the fragment, she's only described as 1/4 African descent. So I was like, okay, let's see what they do with the show. And the fandom really misinterpreted that whole scene. They were like, many people realized that, okay, lady, this whole thing was mean and this was negative, but then they turned that scene into a scene of celebration. And I'm like, Lady Denham was terrible to Georgiana. And then they're like, oh, we're going to make this the symbol of our fandom because we saw one random cast swag giveaway bag that had it on there. But that was not for public consumption. That's where they decided to use the pineapple emoji to symbolize the show. That was not in any of the official tweets or social media messages. The only thing that was in there at the time was, you know, the hashtag for the show, Sanditon, or Sanditon PBS if you're talking about Masterpiece. Or that was the US hashtag. People came up with that and invented it in these Sanditon fan groups and just ran with it. And then, of course, every time somebody tried to tell them this is something a little off, they're like, oh, whatever, you know, you're just trying to, you know, interrupt the fandom, whatever, we're going to do whatever you want. And I'm like, okay, fine. I tried one time before the US aired Sanditon. I was like, okay, fine. Y'all are just going to do whatever you want. Corollary to that is, once people found out Sanditon was canceled in the UK, they launched a massive social media outrage to be like, we need to get the show renewed. So what did they do? They attacked the US hashtags where people have not seen the show yet with renew the show, it's got canceled. And I'm like, first of all, you're leaking spoilers on the hashtag. People haven't seen it yet. You're causing disruption, but they didn't care. So you know, whatever. When the US airing of Sanditon happened, at one point they were like, oh, Americans are not gonna stand the show. And the next second they were like, oh wait, if it does well in the United States, then maybe the show can get renewed. So then they realized they have to engage the American folks. So now Americans are watching the show, they're in the hashtag, they're using the pineapple emojis, and we're all like, why? Who are you all? Because here's the note, many of these people were not Americans. So white European people, white British people have decided to do this, and the US hashtags that PBS created have up until that point have been pretty safe spaces for people of color. Like, I've been on there since the Downton Abbey days, and I know there's a couple of people I've had issues with, but there's even the people I've muted or blocked, I mean, we're not racist, we're just like a lot of personality conflicts, but I know who most of these people are. All of a sudden you see the pineapple emojis invading space, and I'm like, oh no, now you're on my turf. Not my turf as in I own it, but I'm like, I used to feel safe in the space, and now you're spreading your, like, racism everywhere. So I confronted these people. I was like, you came up with this emoji as a symbol of fandom. You didn't ask how people would feel. I'm a Caribbean American woman. Like, some of my ancestors could very well be like Georgiana, or they could easily be somebody who was enslaved. again, I don't know for sure, but it's
Yeah.
a problem. Like, this is, I know the history behind this. You are trying to glorify a scene riddled of microaggressions and actual racism as something nice. This is a no-go. And I had days and weeks of people going back and forth with these people, and a lot of it was white people deciding something they did not to listen. And even though I proposed alternative emojis, because all the sea, beach, top hat emojis, all that was there already on social media. Couldn't use it. Nope, they had to double, triple down. They even had to...
Oh.
People wrote... people... They sent the goons after me, essentially. Like... By this time, the Daily Beast interviewed me. That was almost a month of sustained harassment at that point. I mean, the time's a little blurry. But now we're talking about, like, January, February 2020. So right before coronavirus hit, that's sort of what I was dealing with. At the same time, of course, I had other stuff to worry about as well. Because at that point, I was also starting to cover Outlander Season 5 for Den Geek for the first time. And that was... It's like I'm starting a new freelance gig, and these people are in. I'm like, okay, it's like, thankfully my editor was very good about please ignore my Twitter page. Sorry, they're racist after me. Just ignore them. Like, I'm gonna get the work done, but it's like, this is kind of distracting, looking back on it, and just the failure to understand stuff, and also too, it's like, if you're gonna come up with a symbol of the fandom, why are you deciding that before consulting other people, specifically people of color, about it? It's like the other thing annoyed me too is that there were people in that space that were like, well, I'm not black, but I'm a person of color, and I thought it was fine. I'm like, but your family history may not be like my family history. Yeah, like, I'm sorry, if you're of Asian descent or something else, that's not your decision. Just because you have created yourself to be a fandom authority because you run a popular Twitter page does not mean, or a Facebook page, does not mean people have to agree with you. Because that's the key. Like, none of these people were members of Jazz. None of these people were, or anything else. They were not American. They were not. And people wonder, why are we talking about European people? The thing is, social media has made fandom global. And what happens over there comes over here. And also too, there have been people who have seen the stuff on social media and then have accused in-person Jane Austen groups of being aligned with their pineapple people. For example, there was a costuming group in England. They used the pineapple as a symbol, and all of a sudden people are like, oh, are you those Sanditon racists? They were not affiliated, but that's what happened. They were attacked on Instagram or, called out because that group was interviewed by British press for Bridgerton, and that's what happened. I mean, granted, some people may argue that group probably shouldn't be using pineapples either, but that's not my concern was, in the context of Sanditon fandom, it was clearly shown to be a racist scene. The crew have talked about it in the interviews. The only reason why they were dying on that hill, it's pretty much as you speak, is because they made a decision. They were told people didn't like it, and they decided to just not back down. I think I wrote an essay about it for a academic publication call. So there's about 20 something pages of analysis on what I've noticed, but to boil down to 20 something odd pages, a lot of what happened boiled down to people arguing based on facts that were not facts. There was whitewash history, because yes, there is an argument you can be made that it does mean a symbol of wealth. It does mean people are, it does mean something nice and pretty, but the thing is, in the context of the show, you're getting the exact opposite thing. Exactly. And the thing is, the show never answered the question of why Georgiana was being what was going on with her that she couldn't control her own inheritance. There's something shady there. I mean, the show glorifies Sydney for helping her escape Otis, but that's kind of questionable. Why is he in charge of her? Like, the excuse, and then of course, whenever she would try to defend herself, it was, oh, she was rude and she was mean. No, that's a woman suffering attacks on her own dignity and her own identity. Like, this is the way people are interpreting these plots is in itself problematic. And whenever you talk to people about that, they just ignore it. Or they're like, no, the more important thing about Sanditon is that, oh, the white people don't have their happy ending. I'm like, well, what about Georgiana? This show broke up Otis and her. What happens to her? Do you guys not care? Or they claim to care, but it's like, oh, they're like, oh, no, they're not, she's not a main character. I'm like, that's a poor excuse.
Exactly. In Austen, everybody gets a happy ending, not just the one main character. They usually end up with several people having a happy ending, especially someone who suffers as much as Georgiana suffers. And she does. It's so horrible the way she's treated. Can I, as a white, I don't want to say a woman because I don't identify as a woman, white person, call people out if I see something on Twitter, on Facebook that is really just gross, or isn't even gross, it's just that subtle, underhanded thing. How do I call them out, without resorting to the foul language that, as a masshole, I really want?
Yeah, it's tough. I tend to tell people, depending on what the person's saying, something as simple as, why did you use... Sorry. If people are using terms that are dodgy or like saying, it's like, what do you mean by that term? Or who are you referring to when you say these people? Or stuff like that is questioning. They may not realize, their answer might reveal a lot. Because when people are questioned in a way like, I don't understand, explain this to me, they have to then figure out how to hide their racism or whatever the issue, or homophobia. Like, they're going to have to hide that while responding to you. So if they respond to you like something out the back that's crazy, you're going to just be like, well, which source are you citing on that? Where did you read that from? Especially if it's like a history really question. Then you could go online, grab something that, clearly supports your point of view. And then if they say, well, that source isn't legitimate, it's left-wing propaganda. And I'm like, well, okay, thanks for revealing your cards there. Because, like, one time I linked an article from Vox, and I'm like, they're like, Vox is biased. I'm like,
yeah.
According to who? Somebody who reads, like, Newsmax every day? Like, okay. Like, if they're rejecting scholarly articles and stuff, it's like, oh, because you want... It's a political thing. That's what the other thing too. People don't realize when they say they don't want politics in their fandom, what they really are saying is, I don't want people who disagree with me in my fandom. Or I don't want progressive or, pro-social justice views in my fandom. There's a lot more I could say about this topic, but I know you're running out of time on Zoom since you've...
I know. This is such a amazing topic, and I really wish we had more time. I'm still recording on my side. It hasn't cut off yet, thank goodness. So it's kind of like when you call out sexism, you call them out. You ask in like the most innocent terms, what do you mean by that?
Yeah,
type of thing.
That's one very common tactic. You don't want to go out there full frontal, because the thing is, sometimes it may not be necessary, and other times you don't know who the person is, and you don't know how they're going to react. Also, educating people takes up a lot of your own mental bandwidth, so sometimes you don't want to deal with that. But in terms of structurally, like, if you are a Jasmine member listening to this, what you should be doing with these things is, I do not recall the email that right off the top of my head right now that you should be emailing to support the DEI community. I forgot the name. I don't want to quote the wrong email, so probably link it as a note.
Yeah, I think it's info@jasna.org. And Jedi@jasna.org.
If you're writing those emails to support the committee that is existing still, if you're in a smaller group, ask your leaders, hey, are you looking at speakers of color for your future events? Like, look at the programming, like who's being offered as speakers. Like, are you only inviting the same white academics? Are there people who you could be spotlighting? Are there people who are being, look at those things like, hey, who in our own community are we ignoring because we're so caught up in ourselves? Because that's another thing too. It's like a lot of these smaller jazz and region groups they're not recruiting from within their own community. Right. Like, they're not going, and part of the problem is that there's this perception that the programming is very stilted toward white academia and not what younger fans or fans of color would find interesting or queer fans would find interesting. That's right. The thing. It's like, you have to look at what's missing. Like, who in your community or who you know is missing from those conversations and why? Because there are folks around the fandom who can be hired to talk to your events, or, podcasts that other people and other blogs you should be reading and subscribing and stuff. And that sort of that's the more, and if you're able to, in that sense, that's the more helpful. The email is just the first step. It's like, if you're at a meeting, like, and people are talking about things a certain way, like, why, questioning those things and questioning people who make decisions in your groups. Because trust me, your people of the POC in this community, we know some of who the problem people are. We don't want to, what we want is accountability we're not trying to burn anybody on a pyre. We just want people to change their behavior in the past and then turn themselves around and do a more productive thing. We're not trying to, this whole cancel culture notion is not kind of what people are asking for. It's kind of a misconception. It's like, we want accountability. We don't want people to just hide and keep on doing the same thing. Like, we want people to change positively. Like, if you make these changes that people are suggesting that Jedi committee, it'd be a very good thing. Like, they'll get more members.
I've been talking with Amanda-Rae Prescott. Thank you so much for taking the time out. I really do appreciate it. And I hope that you'll come back. Welcome back, everyone. I hope you enjoyed that discussion with Amanda-Rae Prescott as much as I did. She has such a cool job, and she's definitely not afraid to point out problems in the world. Well, we had a great time talking, and we actually talked off the air for about 2 hours. You can follow Amanda-Rae on Twitter at Amanda-R Prescott, and I hope she comes back again soon. Now back to the books. When last we saw Elinor and Marianne, they were having a terrible night at the Middletons' party. We got to know Sir John and Lady Middleton better. We met Sir John's best friend, who, as the narrator said, seems no more adapted by resemblance of manner to be his friend than Lady Middleton was to be his wife. They also met Lady M's mother, and we'll begin Chapter 8 with a description of Mrs. Jennings. Mrs. Jennings was a widow with an ample jointure. She had only 2 daughters, both of whom she had lived to see respectably married, and she had now therefore nothing to do but marry all the rest of the world. In the promotion of this object she was zealously active, as far as her ability reached, and missed no opportunity of projecting weddings among all the young people of her acquaintance. She was remarkably quick on the discovery of attachments, and had enjoyed the advantage of raising the blushes and the vanity of many a young lady by insinuations of her power over such a young man, and this kind of discernment enabled her soon after her arrival at Barton decisively to pronounce that Colonel Brandon was very much in love with Marianne Dashwood. So unlike Mrs. Dashwood, who received very little when her husband died, Mrs. Jennings had an ample jointure. Now, a jointure is an annual payment made to a widow by her husband's estate. Poor Mrs. D gets hardly anything from her husband's estate, which is why the Dashwoods are in this situation in the first place. So Mrs. J is pretty well off, and that means she has plenty of time to visit her married daughter and tease her teenage guests. So at this point, the Dashwoods and Middletons have had at least 2 dinners together now, and Mrs. Jennings and Colonel Brandon have been a part of both. And during these dinners, Mrs. Jennings noticed something. Colonel Brandon is hot for Marianne Dashwood. She rather suspected it to be so on the very first evening of their being together, from his listening so attentively when she sang to them, and when the visit was returned by the Middletons dining at the cottage, the fact was ascertained by his listening to her again. It must be so. She was perfectly convinced of it. It would be an excellent match, for he was rich and she was handsome. Mrs. Jennings had been anxious to see Colonel Brandon well married ever since her connection with Sir John first brought him to her knowledge, and she was always anxious to get a good husband for every pretty girl. So in modern times, we are totally skeezed out by this. Colonel Brandon is 35, and he's checking out a 17-year-old. That's not okay. Okay, deep breaths, everyone. We need to remember that this story takes place in a very different time. This is not the 21st century. In the 1790s, it was totally fine for a single adult man to be attracted to a teenage girl. Ew. Ew, that's so... But just saying that gives me the shivers. But we need to get past it, at least for the sake of this story. For the sake of Jane, we have to get past this. And Mrs. Jennings doesn't think anything of this age difference, but she knows it bothers Marianne. So she has plenty of fun at both Marianne and Brandon's expense, and they both have such different reactions. It supplied her with endless jokes against them both. At the park, she laughed at the Colonel, and in the cottage at Marianne. Now, this doesn't bother Brandon much. He's as gloomy and taciturn as ever. But Marianne doesn't like this one bit. To the former, her raillery was probably, as far as it regarded only himself, perfectly indifferent. But to the latter it was first incomprehensible, and when its object was understood, she hardly knew whether most to laugh at its absurdity or to censure its impertinence, for she considered it an unfeeling reaction on the Colonel's advanced years, and on his forlorn condition as an old bachelor. So Brandon apparently has no problems with this. He's indifferent to Mrs. Jennings' teasing. At least the narrator believes he is. But Marianne doesn't know how to take it. Should she tell Mrs. Jennings off for being impertinent? Should she laugh at the absurdity of an old man in love with her? And why would Mrs. Jennings be so cruel as to tease an old man about feeling things he's no longer able to? It's inconceivable. But Marianne here, she doesn't allow Brandon to feel emotions such as love because she thinks he's, as we say in Boston, wicked old. She's really settled into this belief since their first meeting. Remember what the narrator said about her thoughts at the attention he paid her piano playing at the end of chapter 7. His pleasure in music, although it mounted not to that ecstatic delight which alone could sympathize with her own, was estimable when contrasted against the horrible insensibility of the others, and she was reasonable enough to allow that a man of 35 might well have outlived all acuteness of feeling and every exquisite power of enjoyment. She was perfectly disposed to make every allowance for the Colonel's advanced state of life which humanity required. As far as Marianne is concerned, Brandon's an old man who can no longer feel feelings. He's insensible to all the sensibilities that she worships. It's like a cult for her, like a flower that withers as the plant ages. Once you cross that fine line from youth to age, life ceases to have any of that kind of meaning that Marianne desires. It stops being about action and desire and is simply about waiting for death. Even if you're only a 35-year-old bachelor. That's kind of depressing. So I came across an article in The Atlantic while researching this episode, and it talked about Marianne's ideas of youth and beauty, and I really think it's pertinent to our discussion today. Marianne spends much of the book believing that the lives of the older people around her are frozen in place. Their circumstances set some time in their youth, because as several characters intimate, little but death can change a person's marital circumstances after a wedding, and none of the main characters of the novel are newlyweds. The years after marriage come to seem to Marianne like a sort of afterlife, and spinsterdom or bachelorhood a sort of purgatory. Children may be born, allowing for more vicarious thrills after the marriage vows are spoken, she suggests, but one ceases to mark milestones of one's own. So Marianne displays all these ideas about hope, love, and life that she believes are absolute. And while there's no room for gray in Marianne's bright world, it's as if to her marriage is a kind of death of the self. And spinsterhood, or bachelordom, is a fate worse than death. So if she must be married someday, she is going to marry someone who views life as a wonder, someone who feels the same passions that she does. She wants a man of feeling, at least for as long as either of them are able to feel. Now, Mrs. D, like me, doesn't think that a man 5 years younger than her is an old bachelor. And we both know that life doesn't end at 35 or 40, maybe 50. But when you marry, or when you have children, aging millennials like us know that it ain't over yet. Mrs. Dashwood could not think a man 5 years younger than herself, so exceedingly ancient as he appeared to the youthful fancy of her daughter, ventured to clear Mrs. Jennings from the probability of wishing to throw ridicule on his age. But Marianne is still focused on the very idea of his infatuation. But at least, Mamma, you cannot deny the absurdity of the accusation, though you may not think it intentionally ill-natured. Colonel Brandon is certainly younger than Mrs. Jennings, but he is old enough to be my father, and if he were ever animated enough to be in love, must have long outlived every sensation of the kind. It is too ridiculous. When is a man to be safe from such wit if age and infirmity will not protect him? Infirmity, said Elinor. Do you call Colonel Brandon infirm? I can easily suppose that his age may appear much greater to you than to my mother, but you can hardly deceive yourself as to his having the use of his limbs. Did you not hear him complaining of the rheumatism? And is not that the commonest infirmity of declining life? My dearest child, said her mother, laughing, at this rate you must be in continual terror of my decay, and it must seem to you a miracle that my life has been extended to the advanced age of 40. Mamma, you are not doing me justice. I know very well that Colonel Brandon is not old enough to make his friends yet apprehensive of losing him in the course of nature. He may live 20 years longer, but 35 has nothing to do with matrimony. Okay, so Marianne claims to have a reason for calling Colonel Brandon old. Apparently he's got rheumatism, and complaining about aches and pains, of course, it makes you an old man in the eyes of a 17-year-old. Which means that I've been old since I was 12, but that's a different story. Elinor now has to voice her very sensible thoughts. Perhaps, said Elinor, 35 and 17 had better not have anything to do with matrimony together. But if there should by any chance happen to be a woman who was single at 7 and 20, I should not think Colonel Brandon's being 35 any objection to his marrying her. All right, so Elinor's like, okay, maybe 35 and 17 is too wide an age gap, but a single woman only 10 years older than Marianne very likely wouldn't turn up her nose at the proposal by a 35-year-old man. Marianne's got a response for that. A woman of 7 and 20, said Marianne after pausing a moment, can never hope to feel or inspire affection again, and if her home be uncomfortable, were her fortune small, I can suppose that she might bring herself to submit to the offices of a nurse, for the sake of the provision and the security of a wife. In his marrying such a woman, therefore, there would be nothing unsuitable. It would be a compact of convenience, and the world would be satisfied. In my eyes, it would be no marriage at all, but that would be nothing. To me, it would only seem a commercial exchange, in which each wished to be benefited at the expense of the other. That's really harsh. It would be impossible, I know, replied Elinor, to convince you that a woman of 27 could feel for a man of 35 anything near enough to love, to make him a desirable companion to her. But I must object to your dooming Colonel Brandon and his wife to the constant confinement of a sick chamber, merely because he chanced to complain yesterday, a very cold, damp day, of a slight rheumatic feeling in one of his shoulders. But he talked of flannel waistcoats, said Marianne, and with me a flannel waistcoat is invariably connected with aches, cramps, rheumatisms, and every species of ailment that can afflict the old and the feeble. Had he been only in a violent fever, you would not have despised him half so much. Confess, Marianne, is not there something interesting to you in the flushed cheek, hollow eye, and quick pulse of a fever? Oh, so Marianne has a really harsh thoughts on marriage. It makes me wonder what her own parents' marriage was like. We don't know anything about it. We're told that they lived a very happy life with old man Dashwood. We can assume it was happy. But, of course, the past 2 years her mother was probably first nursing Uncle Dashwood and then her husband. But they were older. Uncle Dashwood was anyways, and Henry, the girl's father, was significantly older than his wife. Since John is about 30 at the present, that puts Henry at least 50, and likely older than that. So maybe Marianne is thinking about the age difference in her own parents, or how her father got sick when his daughters were only teenagers and her mother had to nurse him before he died. Maybe she's thinking about the difficulties of an even younger widow would be in having to care for children after her much older husband dies. And a commercial exchange, that's really cold. At the same time, this is how people contracted weddings at this time. People usually, well, the upper classes and the middle class did not usually marry for love. It was a contract. It was an exchange of goods and services. I will marry this man and he will provide me with a home, and in exchange I will give him children. That was what it was. It was a commercial exchange. It was a benefit at the expense of the other. Marianne isn't wrong here. It's a very cold, cynical way of thinking for such a romantic girl. But she's not wrong. And maybe Marianne is using flannel waistcoats and aches and cramps as an excuse to avoid talking about something that would be too painful for all of them. But then again, maybe Marianne is using flannel waistcoats, aches, and cramps as an excuse to avoid talking about something that would be too painful for all of them. Maybe she isn't as shallow as this conversation makes her sound. Perhaps she has real and legitimate concerns about marrying a much older man. But she's too worried about the feelings of her family to bring them up after mourning her father for the past 7 months. And of course, Elinor teases Marianne's response, saying that if he was complaining of fevers rather than chills and stiffness, she'd like him much more and be far more compassionate. And this is one of Elinor's gentle digs at Marianne's adherence to this cult of sensibility. Novels of sensibility were fascinated with acute illness and apparently equated illness with a spiritual quality. While stiff shoulders are too physical for someone who is interested in that spiritual quality of sensibility. Elinor now leaves the room after this conversation, and Marianne changes the subject from her own love life to her sister's. "Mamma," said Marianne, "I have an alarm on the subject of illness which I cannot conceal to you. I am sure Edward Ferrars is not well. We have now been here almost a fortnight, and yet he does not come. Nothing but real indisposition could occasion this extraordinary delay. What else can detain him at Norland?" Had you any idea of his coming so soon? Said Mrs. Dashwood. I had none. On the contrary, if I have felt any anxiety at all on the subject, it has been in recollecting that he sometimes showed a want of pleasure and readiness in accepting my invitation when I talked to him of coming to Barton. Does Elinor expect him already? I have never mentioned it to her, but of course she must. I rather think you are mistaken, for when I was talking to her yesterday of getting a new grate for the spare bedroom, she observed that there was no immediate hurry for it, as it was not likely that the room would be wanted for some time. How strange it is! What can be the meaning of it? But the whole of their behavior to each other has been unaccountable. How cold, how composed they were at their last adieus! How languid their conversation the last evening of their being together! In Edward's farewell, there was no distinction between Elinor and me. It was the good wishes of an affectionate brother to both. Twice did I leave them purposely together in the course of the last morning, and each time did he most unaccountably follow me out of the room. And Elinor, in quitting Norland and Edward, cried not as I did. Even now her self-command is invariable. When is she dejected or melancholy? When does she try to avoid society or appear restless and dissatisfied with it? So Marianne is far more worried about Edward Ferrars than she is about her own love life. She thinks he's sick. Why else is he not visiting them? She can't conceive of any other reason for him not immediately rushing to Devonshire to visit Elinor. Maybe this is why she's so focused on Brandon's health. She's equating Brandon's stiffness and complaints with Edward's no-showing. If Brandon complains about a cold, damp day, then Edward must be terribly ill to not visit Elinor. But Mrs. D points out that he didn't seem all that excited about visiting when she invited him, very purposely in front of his sister, and so she doesn't expect him to visit soon, and she points out that Elinor doesn't even expect him to visit. And Marianne, again, she's just awed by her sister's self-command. She always behaves so properly and doesn't show anxiety or distress over losing Edward. She is in control all the time, and Marianne can't understand how she does it, and I can't understand how she does it either. Marianne cried over a tree, and, well, I don't blame her for that. I mean, geez, Elinor, have some emotions. You're going to get a tumor or an ulcer or something. And remember Marianne's words here. When is she dejected or melancholy? When does she try to avoid society or appear restless and dissatisfied with it? Remember those words, because in the future we're going to see her play out all of those emotions that she wishes to see Elinor express. Well, this has been quite an episode. That's the end of today's chapter. I hope that you enjoyed our special episode as much as I did. Many thanks to Amanda-Rae Prescott for taking the time out of her busy schedule to visit with me, and thank you so much for listening. Today's episode was written by me, Casey Meserve, and produced by my brother, Jeremy Meserve. If you like the show, you can leave a review on Apple Podcasts. It really helps me out. You can join the conversation with me on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook, or write to me at enceandsensibility@gmail.com. Thanks again, and I hope you'll visit again soon.